Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
And I'm Rabbi Kahn, and today we'll be talking about desire discrepancy, and defining consent. We'll get to that in just a moment. First, remember to check out our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikveh checklist, and more. Subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcasts, rate and review, and leave a comment too. Tell people about Intimate Judaism and share the podcast so that we can continue to grow our audience. In fact, November was by far our biggest month ever in terms of downloads, so thank you, and please help us spread the word. Join the Intimate Judaism team on Patreon. Patreon supporters get bonus material, episodes, merch, and more. You can find the link in the description of the podcast as well as in the show notes. Write to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Visit jewishcoffeehouse.com and tallirosenbaum.com. Talli, let's open up with a question about why we're doing this episode. We have talked about desire and consent and discrepancies in desire on earlier podcasts on Intimate Judaism. Why do you think it's important that we talk about this topic again?
Well, now that I'm hearing you ask that question, one of the principles of consent is that you sort of renegotiate it along the way throughout the course of your relationship. So even though we've talked about consent before and we've talked about desire before, I'd like to consider this part of the renegotiation of our relationship. Let's talk about consent again, and let's talk about desire again, and maybe even have a more nuanced conversation. We've had a few listeners also who have asked us to talk about consent. And I think that many other couples therapists, like I am, and also sex therapists, are inundated with this particular presentation. The idea of a sexual desire discrepancy between partners, where one partner wants more often, one is less interested or has less desire. So that's very common, and I want to be able to talk more about that. But the idea of desire, which I think is very complex, but we can think about in terms of wanting, is different than the idea of willing. In other words, when we talk about desire, what do we mean by desire? Do we mean I want as much as you want, and so therefore let's do it? Or does it mean you want, I'm not there, but I'm willing to get there? Or does it mean I don't want, so I'm not going to consent? Or does it mean I don't want, but I'm going to consent because I don't feel like I have a choice? So there are different levels of consent that I want to be able to talk about. And I want to be able to talk about the concept of spontaneous desire versus responsive desire.
So it sounds like you're saying that when we deal with consent, we often use that phrase, no means no. And of course, that's true. But no isn't the only thing that means no. There are a lot of other levels that are involved in consent. Consent isn't a black or white issue. There are many different gradations of it. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, well, neither is desire a black and white issue. And that's why we need to have a more nuanced conversation about it. So I'm going to start with talking a little bit about desire and also kind of the gendered approach to desire. So when sex research began in the late 40s and 50s, and then Masters and Johnson in their work, in the beginning of sex research, there was very little differentiation between men and women in terms of their desire or in terms of their arousal. The only differences that they really talked about was that it took women longer to reach a climax than men, and that the cycle looked a little bit different.
The cycle of desire, in other words.
The cycle going from desire to arousal to orgasm and then resolution. So if you look at the graphs, they'll look a little bit different, with male arousal going into a sharp kind of peak and then coming down, where women will take a longer time to get to that peak. And that was really the only difference. Now, what happened is that when Pfizer came out with Viagra as an erectile dysfunction drug, and it was very popular, researchers started looking at women's sexuality and saying, I wonder if we can find a drug for women's libido as well. Because at that time, there were studies that had just started coming out looking at why women reported wanting less sex than men. And they were obviously using the same kind of expectations for women's desire that they were for men's desire. In other words, you have quote unquote normal levels of desire if you, just like men, think about sex, fantasize about sex, have spontaneous desire for sex. And so many women on these studies endorsed not having that. And so they were then diagnosed with hypoactive sexual desire disorder. If you don't feel like you want to have sex, there must be something wrong with you. At the time, there was also a real kind of looking at medications that might help women's libido. There have been some different trials of different medications and some FDA approval of some medications, but nothing that has really proven itself to work. And part of the problem is that you really can't reduce desire to one variable, to an organic variable or a psychological variable or a relational variable. There's just too many variables that affect and impact whether a woman's going to have desire. But I'm talking about women's desire because sexual research began to be very gendered, that there's a very big difference between men's spontaneous or initiative-based desire because they have more of the initiation hormones like testosterone, and women are more receptive because estrogen is more of a receptive hormone. And so women's desire doesn't necessarily need to be spontaneous, but what women need to have is something called receptive desire, which means I may not really be in the mood, but I have incentive, I have motivation. I know that it's something that once I get started, I'm going to like it. It's going to be good. I'm going to enjoy it. And the reward is intimacy. I know it's a good thing. I have, what's called cognitive drive, if not a great deal of biological drive, because desire can be divided into cognitive and biological and other kind of contributors to that. But let me just end that by saying now it's 2022 and the research around desire is beginning to look at less gendered specific desire in order to kind of take away that binary of gender from male hormones, female hormones. And that's just an interesting aside, also because of the move away from binary sexual identity, but also because in practice, we see more than we did, let's say 10 years ago, of men coming in and saying that they also struggle with desire disorders.
So I just want to summarize to make sure that I understand what you said until now correctly. So it sounds like in the 80s, there was a general assumption based on research that was, I'm not going to call it gendered, but it was maybe male-centric, that women have less desire than men overall. Later on, that was changed as the research became more gendered and saying it's a different kind of desire, not necessarily less. And now coming to the modern times, or wherever we are now, gendered is being removed altogether, and we're looking more at a spectrum of different types of desire without looking at it in a gendered sense. Is that a correct summary of what you said?
That's a correct summary, more or less. I think the important part of this is the model that was introduced in the year 2000, which is the model of responsive desire. And this is a model that was introduced by Rosemary Basson from Canada. And what she basically did was she reframed the experience of women's sexuality because so many women were feeling pathologized and that something was wrong with them because they felt that there was an expectation that they have this spontaneous desire at the same level and the same frequency of their partners, when in fact, over time, studies began to show that women, especially women in monogamous marriage, many of them don't relate to having spontaneous desire that they're aware of. Part of it is that women are very busy and they're caretakers and they don't always stop to be very aware of their own needs. Sometimes women can go a full day and just forget to drink water. And again, this is very gendered, stereotypical, which again, sex research is moving away from. But I do want to talk about it because I think that it has really impacted the way that the sex therapy community has talked to women about sexual desire. The model talks about having motivation for sex. It talks about the cognitive drive as being an important drive for sex. And so in a way, what the model helps do is it helps reframe, but also helps encourage women by saying, look, You don't have to be in the mood going in. You just have to want to be in the mood. And if you want to be in the mood and you're open to sex, then what'll happen is that you'll start to have sex with your husband. He'll press all the right buttons. You'll get aroused, tach kadeh, in the middle of it. And you'll end up having a really good experience and you'll be really happy that you did it. And in fact, it's very much like it's 9:00 at night and it's pouring outside and your friend calls you and says, come on, we have a Zumba class. And you're like, no, I'm too tired. I really don't want to go. She says, no, go to Zumba. You'll be happy that you did. And then you go to Zumba and you're like, oh, wow, that was great. Like, I got to do this every week. This is so fun. I'm really glad I did that. So that's kind of the framing of the Bassan model. And it's caught on big. And the reason why I wanted to bring it up, because I think it's very important to look at that also in terms of enthusiastic consent, because enthusiastic consent, it's not.
That's what I was going to ask you about, because this seems to really affect that tremendously.
Right. Well, first of all, what's good about the model is that it allows women to feel very normal about themselves. Like, I'm okay if I'm not thinking about having sex with my husband day and night. Like, there's nothing wrong with me. It may come up clinically or it may come up relationally where, the man might say, like, why are you never into me? Why don't you want me? Like, why don't you initiate? And so she may initiate based on the Bassan model, because she might say to herself, I know it's important. I know it's good for our marriage. I know it gives intimacy. I know I have a good time and I like it and I always feel satisfied. So if I forget, because I sometimes forget to think about my sex drive, or I just forget to think about sex, I'll keep it in my list of things to do. And I'll remember to initiate as well, because he likes that too when I do that too. So the reason why it's important to talk about this is because it really brings us into the conversation about levels of consent and what does consent mean, and also why it's so important that to desire sex, the sex has to be worth having. In other words, in that model, in that responsive desire model, what makes it work is that there's incentive, and the incentive is that the sex is good. You're having a good time. You're coming out of there feeling satisfied. But the next question is, what if you're not? What if you're not enjoying it? And what if you're not feeling satisfied? But there are other incentives. My husband will be in a good mood. He'll help me with the kids. Is that considered to be consensual if you're doing it because you kind of fear the consequences? Well, there's fearing the consequences of not doing it.
Yeah, that's actually a very broad term.
But there's also benefiting from the positive consequence. This is where I would break it up. I would break it up, first of all, by looking at the dynamic of sexual desire discrepancies, that it doesn't necessarily mean that one person doesn't want to have sex enough and the other person wants to have too much. Like, what we don't want to do is pathologize one partner or shame them for wanting to have sex with their partner. I mean, it's a very beautiful, wonderful, normal thing to want to have sex with your partner, but we also don't want to pathologize the other person for not having that same biological drive, even if they might have motivation and incentive and other features that will allow sex to happen. But we don't want to necessarily pathologize desire that is generally responsive and not just spontaneous.
Why don't you go through the levels of consent now, Talli? And full disclosure, in preparing for this episode, I was trying to do some research in terms of what consent is. And for example, something which, this is not levels of consent, something which I saw in numerous places was the acronym FRIES. It's called consent is only consent if it's freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. I saw that in more than one place. And I accept that. And in fact, throughout this podcast, we've often spoken about the importance of enthusiastic consent. But in preparing, I saw that that's not universally regarded as necessary. I'm not speaking about halakha now. I'm speaking about in the therapeutic community that there can be such a thing as non-enthusiastic but still valid consent that is a healthy form of consent. So I'll just leave it at that from what I saw.
Yeah, we can talk about that. I mean, like in Israel, they talk about, haskama, which is agreement, versus ratzon, which is really desire, wanting. Enthusiastic wanting is something that may not necessarily be present at the beginning of the sexual interaction because, you're not 20 years old, you're in a long-term monogamous marriage. You don't have that same necessarily passion, although you may have the love and you may have the connection, you may have the intimacy, but you may not, you may have to come up with that desire once you're in. And that doesn't mean it's not consensual. what you didn't say is that you can't always consent. As a matter of fact, you can't really consent in certain situations. And some of those situations are completely objective. There's an objective power differential, with boss, employee, rabbi, congregant, teacher, student. Like when there's a power differential, you're already in a position where you're under in the hierarchy. There's somebody above you. And so there really already is going to be a built-in consequence to non-consenting. So is that really consent?
Right. Well, at least in this model that I mentioned a moment ago, I think that some include that under freely given, saying it can't be under the influence of drugs or alcohol. It can't be in a power imbalance because that's not really truly freely given.
Right. So that's what I want to talk about in relation to some of the things that we spoke about in episode 9 when we talked about halachic obligation to have sex and where that might fit in on the levels of consent that I'm going to be talking about now. So let's say the first level of consent is enthusiastic. You want, I want, we both want, let's go have some sexy time together. It's not just to make a baby, obviously, it's to engage together. We're both equal partners and we want to engage together. We want to connect. We want to have pleasure together. And it's completely, no question about it, consensual. I think the next level would fall into the level of the Rosemary Bassan model, in a sense, which is, I don't really feel it. Like I'm not feeling it, but I'm happy for you to get me there. I can take it or leave it, but I'm happy to take it. And you know what to do to get me there. And I want this. I want to do it. I want to do it for our connection. I want to do it for our intimacy. I want to do it because I want the pleasure. I want to feel good. And I want you to feel good. I care about you. I care about you and I want you to feel good. Now, I'm going to bring a little bit of nuance to the next 2 levels. And by the way, I do want to refer to an article that speaks about this very clearly. And this article is called Enthusiastic, Willing, Unwilling, and Coerced. It's by Emily Nagoski, and her name might sound familiar because she is the author of the very popular book about female sexuality called Come As You Are, a book that I very much recommend highly. When she begins to get into the 3rd and the 4th levels, I like to differentiate on that 3rd level. So that 3rd level is, I'm not in the mood and I do fear the consequence of saying no. So it's a big jump. The jump from 2 to 3 is a big jump. And I want to insert another level into her 4 levels. So I'm going to call it 2A or 2.5. Okay. So that level is, I'm not in the mood. I don't really want it, but I'm choosing it. I'm choosing it because I want the positive outcome. So in other words, I don't really want to do it. And I may not even get in the mood because I'm tired. But, once in a while, I want to do this for my partner, even if I don't want to do it. And also, I'm not a victim here. Like, I don't feel like a victim. And the reason why I want to add this particular level is because I hear this a lot. I hear this from women who say, look, I don't always have to have an orgasm, but sometimes I'll do it because I feel like I am choosing it. And I think that that's the important nuance of this, is that I feel like I'm choosing it. I don't feel pressure or coercion. I don't fear negative consequences.
I'm not really in the mood for it either.
I'm not really.
And I don't think I'm going to be in the mood for it when you're done either.
And I don't think I'm going to be in the mood, but I don't want to say no as much as I do want to say no.
But this is different than being afraid to say no, which is being unwilling.
Right. So this is very different. So this now goes into her 3rd or 4th categories, which is really the fear of the consequences of saying no. Now, I'm not threatened by the consequences of saying no. Okay. I'm not threatened that I'm going to be hurt if I say no, but I'm going to pay a price if I say no. And I don't want to pay that price. I'm going to pay a price and I don't want to pay that price. And then that last one is coercion, because either I can't say no, which is what we talked about, one of those categories of power differentials or being drunk. And this is where it's going to get a little bit tricky. My religion makes me. In other words, if my husband needs it, if my college teacher, or if I learned that I shouldn't say no, that's really in that category. It's built in. I'm putting it out there because fearing the wrath of God, fearing my husband's pain and anger if he ends up sinning because of me. That's category 4. That's not consensual. That's coercive.
So can I just make one comment about that? And I agree completely, by the way. This is not disagreeing. I also read the article by Emily Nagowski that you sent to me. And I almost would take category 4, that last category, and they're really the same thing. But just for clarity, I think it should be divided into 2 separate categories so people understand. There's not consenting, which is saying no. Then there is verbally consenting or implicitly consenting, but it's still no, which is what you're talking about now. In other words, her 4th category is not somebody saying, no, don't do it, which is open coercion. This is rather somebody technically on a verbal level, not objecting, I guess we could say, but in practice, it's complete coercion, right?
Yeah, it is complete coercion if you are not allowed to say no. There's messaging that's very direct about not being allowed to say no. And that, of course, is a human rights violation to tell a woman that she has to have sex because if she does not, her husband might sin. He might have sex with someone else, or he might ejaculate not inside her vagina, which is not a legal way to ejaculate, and it will be her fault for that occurring, is threatening because it feels like you're doing something that you're not allowed to do. And so that would be level 4. But of course, there could be messaging that is less outright than that is more subtle, such as maybe think twice before you say no, or maybe really be careful about trying to be with your husband whenever he wants to or needs to be. And there's messaging like Isha Kshera Osa Ratzon Ba'ala. It is the kosher woman who does her husband's bidding. There's messaging that says a woman's role is to guard her husband from sin. And so these messages create a situation where women will believe the default position is that when their husband wants sex, they need to be available to provide it to them. They need to ask a rabbi if for some reason they're unable to do so, whether it's because they're in pain or whether it's because they just had a baby and they're really tired, or whether it's because they are having chemotherapy treatments and they're really, really exhausted and they don't even feel anything down there except for pain because of the hormonal treatments and the radiation. And they're still very, very concerned about what's going to happen to their husband. So there's a lot of these situations where you have to really wonder if built into the model of how women are being taught, and also men are being taught in terms of their entitlement, or in terms of how they're not going to be able to manage if their wife isn't available to them. And we have to wonder if there aren't built in coercive and non-consensual messages being given as part of the systemic problem that we have in this area. And of course, it's on a continuum, it's on a spectrum. And I'm happy to say that in many communities, this has changed a lot. But it's interesting that the Basan model has become very popular as a way to, at the very least, enhance the idea of cognitive desire. Because what a lot of college teachers do try to do is promote the value of sex and kind of encourage or get women to want to have sex with their husbands, also because of the value of the mitzvah. But it should not be done out of a threat of what's going to happen if they don't. And when that does happen, it's really problematic. The idea that inherently built into some of the systems are the idea that you're going in at level 3 or 4 is problematic. And it's there. What we talked about in episode 9 was that if you look for the legal entitlement to coerce your wife to have sex, to tell her that she's mishuabedet, and using what Chazal said, using that to oppress, to entitle you to get what you want, that's definitely level 4.
Yeah. I want to talk about some of those halachic issues specifically and go into them. But before we do, I want to ask you, and you, I think, imply the answer anyway, but from your perspective as a sex and couples therapist, Talli, of those 5 levels, I'm using your term now with the 2.5 in the middle there, Are 1, 2, and 3, everything above unwilling consent and coercive consent, all valid consent, such that one could say if they're having sex in that context, it's a perfectly valid way of doing things? Or is, for example, I'm having sex even though I don't really want it because I want the positive consequences, not really consent? How do you look at it?
Look, I don't think that the question is whether or not it's valid. I think the question is it sustainable? Is this the kind of sex that you want to be having? Is this the kind of sex that your husband wants to be having? In other words, yeah, I'm sure that I could, quote unquote, trust a woman if she comes and says, look, I'm happy to give my husband what he wants. It doesn't cost me anything. It doesn't feel good, but it doesn't hurt me. And if this is what I want to be, if this is what he needs, if this is what he wants, and this is what I have to do, then I'll do it. And you're asking me, is this really valid consent? I think the question is more, is this a sustainable kind of situation? When is it going to come the time that you are going to begin to resent this? When is it a time that you're going to begin to dread this? And especially if you really don't feel that you are able to say no to it, when does this actually turn into trauma for you? When does your body begin to tighten up when your husband walks into the room? When do you start to think to yourself, is this a free night that I get to go to sleep? Or is this yet another night that I have to engage in relations that I don't really even want to have? And then when I talk to husbands, I often say to them, what is it like for you to have this kind of sex? And usually they say, well, this is not what I want at all. I told her I don't want to be having sex like this. I want her to enjoy. So the question is really, are you doing anybody any favors by having sex that you're not enjoying and that you don't really want to have? So I think the question about, whether it's okay to have this kind of arrangement or this kind of situation is really more a question of what are the costs involved in doing that? And at that point, what I might want to be doing in the therapy room is really talking about what consent looks like, but also what consent feels like, how much more valuable it is to be able to communicate with physical intimacy in a way that impacts you and impacts your partner in positive ways, where you can positively affect and get positive reactions from one another, where you can engage together. Isn't that so much more valuable and so much more sexually healthy for yourself and also for your marriage and for your relationship?
What I think it means overall, for me at least, is that this opens up a new concept beyond enthusiastic consent. Consent can mean more than that and still be valid consent. That's something which I hadn't really realized.
Sure. Well, look, if we are defining enthusiastic consent as, what you see in the movies, that you're head over heels and you just cannot wait to get your hands all over each other. I don't know that I know too many couples in long-term monogamous marriages who feel that on a regular basis. I mean, it would be nice to say that on mikvah night, you want that, like you're ready for that. And maybe we'll get tons of listeners writing in that'll say, what are you talking about? We're always into it with each other and we always want it with each other. And we've been married 20 years. And if I go for like 3 days without touching my husband or without having sex with my husband, I go crazy. And I think that there's certainly people that will normatively be involved in an enthusiastically consensual relationship at all times. And that's great. That's wonderful. But again, the Bassan model really normalizes. Look, you could also call it enthusiastic consent. It's willing consent, though. It's really more, I'm willing because I'm willing to want. I'm willing to go into it, not out of a place of enthusiastic, spontaneous desire, but I'm willing to go into it from a place of wanting to want and knowing that things will kick in once I start to get turned on and it's going to be good for me. So let's do it. And within moments, I'm there. I think that that's enthusiastic consent minus.
It's a different kind of enthusiastic consent.
Yeah.
I think this might be a good time for us to look at some of the halachic sources that talk about the issues you and I have been discussing today, in particular, the area of consent. And frankly, today I went down a bit of a rabbit hole in preparing for this podcast. I spent most of the day looking at different sources. And of course, like anything, halacha is not a monolith. In this case either, there are different voices. But I think I got a general feel of how the sources are directed. I'll preface what I'm going to say by mentioning that I had a conversation last week with a couple of people about a Gemara that we've mentioned before, Nidarim Daf Kaf Amud Bet, 20b, where a woman walks in front of Rabbi and she says, Rabbi, this is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Rabbi, I prepared the table and my husband turned it over. Hafichata shulchan either means he had anal sex with her, or it might mean that he did it in the non-missionary position. There are different opinions about what it exactly means. It means it was something atypical in terms of the way they had sex. And Rabbi answered her, my daughter, the Torah allowed you to him. What can I do about it? And I've always explained this Gemara as saying they're not talking about consent. She wasn't complaining that he did something against her desire, against her will. She was complaining that she didn't think it was frum enough. Is this allowed? And Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was saying, yes, it is allowed. And in this conversation, the people I was talking to, I think fairly enough, said, come on. It looks a lot like he's saying, you have no choice over here. Meaning you're allowed to him, and therefore, if the Torah allows you, you have to do this. So I understand reading it like that. But taking a single line of the Gemara out of context can often lead us to conclusions that are not halachic and that are not intended even by the Gemara itself. And this is a good example of that, because if we look at the weight of opinion in Shas, if we look at other Gemaras, which are very, very clear about this, as well as the way it's been interpreted through the years by the Rishonim and the Achronim, it is quite clear that coercion is not allowed. And I'd like to explain why. I'm going to go through a few sources. I'm going to read them primarily in English to save time. We will put them up in the show notes in the Intimate Judaism website. And my inclination after looking at the sources, but before reading Emily Nagowski's article, was that there are really probably 4 categories over here. So it was very interesting and actually enlightening for me to read afterwards that she had 4 categories as well, although it may not be the exact same 4 categories. But I kind of was thinking of it in terms of 4 different levels on some level, and I'm curious what you think of it too. So the first Gemara I want to cite is a Gemara in Eruvin Daf Kaf Amud Bet, Eruvin 100b. I'm not paraphrasing, but I am going to skip around a little bit. It says there, Rami Bar Chama said in the name of Rav Asi, it is forbidden for a man to force his wife to have sex. It literally is forbidden for him to force her in a matter of a mitzvah, but the context is clearly having sex. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, anyone who forces his wife to have sex will have unworthy children. Rav Ika Bar Chinana says, what verse shows this? And the answer is, Gam below da'at nefesh lo tov. It's a pasuk from Mishlei. It's understood as, also without knowledge or consent, the soul will not be good. In other words, the child's soul will somehow have damage to it if it is conceived without the wife's consent. All right, that is the first source. The second source is from Nidarim Daf Kaf Amud Bet, Nidarim 20b, the same source I cited earlier, a little later on the same page. It says there, quoting a pasuk in Yecheskel Perek Kaf, I will purge from you those who rebel and sin against me. That's the pasuk. Rabbi Levi says, these are the 9 inappropriate attributes that take place during intercourse. I'm not going to mention all 9. I'm going to mention 3 now, relevant to our situation. Children of fear. The word there is ema, fear or awe, something like that. Children of rape. Children of drunkenness. And this is understood by different people in different ways. The one that's obvious that everyone agrees is children of rape. That means if there's spousal rape, if the husband rapes his wife, if there was not consent, then this is clearly prohibited by the Gemara. Children of fear is understood in different ways by different people. In fact, there are even different texts of the Gemara. Some don't have that. Some have a different word, children of a maidservant, ama instead of ema. But according to the Ran, for example, what this means, children of fear, is that it's not enough that the husband doesn't rape his wife, meaning have sex coercively. It also must not be done under fear. He can't force her verbally, make her afraid not to have sex. That also is completely invalid. The Ran does say that, but there are others who say it as well. I'm now going to read a third source, which is the Rambam, going out of the Gemaras. And there are many others also. I'm just giving a selection over here. The Rambam in Hilchot Isurei Bia, 2112, Kaf Aleph Halacha Yud Bet, says, he may not have sex with his wife against her will, and if she's afraid of him. Once again, this idea of fear in the context of getting her to have sex is invalid. There's something else, though, which I want to read in the Rambam, which is quite different. The Rambam in Hilchot Deot, Perek He Halacha Daled 5:4 says, "V'lo yanos ota v'hi eina rotza, el beratzon shnehem uvesimchatan." The Rambam says he may not rape her, and she is not willing, rather with the desire of both of them and with their joy. Now, the Rambam here seems to be saying something different from what he said earlier, where in the laws of Isurei Bia, the Rambam said that you can't do it if she's afraid of you, if she's afraid of it, which sounds like, I don't know if that's unwilling, I don't know, but it definitely is coercive consent. You can't do that. But over here, he's saying she has to be joyful about it. This sounds a lot like enthusiastic consent. And I think the answer is, I have not seen this inside, but it's pretty clear, I think, that this is the answer. The Rambam in Hilchot Deot is saying these are the attributes of a Talmid Chacham. This is not the letter of the law. This is not what you have to do. This is what you should aspire to. And this reminds me of what Rav Soloveitchik said, as quoted by Rabbi Walter Wurzburger, that halacha is a floor, not a ceiling, when it comes to ethics. And I think this might be a good example of that, where the Rambam is saying, Me'ikar hadin, this is my interpretation of it, so take it or leave it, but Me'ikar hadin, what is prohibited is coercive sex, and perhaps sex that is unwilling because of fear. What is desired, however, is enthusiastic consent. That may not be the requirement, but enthusiastic consent is the goal that one should try to reach. And so in using, Talli, the 4 categories that you mentioned before, or the 4.5 categories you mentioned before, if we talk about enthusiastic consent, willing consent, unwilling consent, and coercive consent, I think it's pretty clear from looking at these sources and others, which I'm not going to get into now, and there's also a Magen Avram, which is very important, but I'll put that in the show notes, that coercive consent, and obviously coercion too, is halachically prohibited. Not just a bad idea, but not allowed. Enthusiastic consent is an ideal, at least according to the Rambam. Willing consent is certainly allowed. And when it comes to unwilling consent, that level of, I don't want to deal with the consequences. I'm not afraid, but I don't want to have to deal with the consequences of not doing it. Frankly, I'm not sure. I think it depends on whom you ask. I think it depends on which source you look at, because the sources don't use these same categories. So even though I'm able to put them into 4 categories like that, I can't try and insert Emily Nagowski's categories into the Rishonim. That obviously was not their intention. It does match pretty well, but ultimately I don't want to try to play the apologetics game over here to say that, oh, halacha completely forbids unwilling consent, or however it's termed there. I'm not sure. I think it depends on whom you ask. But I do think it's pretty clear, though, that the ideal is to have enthusiastic consent according to the Rambam. And let me repeat that if we accept this idea that halacha is a floor and not a ceiling when it comes to moral and ethical matters, then there's much more to say. One thing may be prohibited, but another thing may be seen as a true ideal for all of us, even if it's not technically mandated by the halacha. So even if halachically we are not going to say that technically having sex after receiving only unwilling consent is prohibited, it's not technically an avera, it's not technically forbidden. Nevertheless, we can say that's not the way you should behave. That is not the way the Torah wants you to behave. It's not in the spirit of what the Torah is looking for. Even if technically it's not prohibited, it can still be wrong. And I'm not the only one who says this. Rav Aaron Lichtenstein and many, many others say this too. There are things that are allowed in halacha, but you are not supposed to do them, even if they're technically not isurim. We don't only look at the technical prohibitions to say what one should do. We also look at what one is supposed to do, even if it's not technically an isur. And that's how I would look at these particular issues here.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you're saying this. I'm going to say the same thing a little bit, but in a little bit of a different way, because if we go back to episode 9, we quoted some of what you're quoting. You're quoting some new ones that are great for showing that the Torah, maybe the spirit of the law, does not like coercive sex. But we also brought some sources in episode 9 where you could certainly make a good argument that it's completely within the halachic floor, as you put it, to coerce your wife into having sex, that it is your entitlement and she is mishuabedet to you. And we had that discussion then, and it triggered me then, no less than it is still doing now. So I'm going to look at it a little bit differently, which is that we have to be able to appreciate an ongoing, dynamic, changing, ethical approach to sexuality as going along with the spirit of what the Torah actually wants, as you so beautifully put it, and understanding that even though there might be halachic ground, there's halachic ground because of reality that doesn't exist anymore. In other words, women
what do you mean
really
by that?
Well, the status of women at that time was such that they needed laws for protection. They needed laws to protect them because they didn't have their own property. They didn't have a way to support themselves. The institution of marriage was one in which she was protected by the ketubah. So her sexual resources that she brought to the marriage, as the Netziv put it very well, this is why people get married. This is what she needs to be doing. And the arrangement wasn't, romantic love based then so much. It was an institution, and you have each your obligations and your gender roles. And today we are in a modern society where we really do expect to fall in love, and we expect to have all different types of relationships and navigate more equal, balanced gender roles. And so we, in a modern society, are going to have to move away from certain mores that maybe were used at the time, hopefully not, but we know that they are used today. We know that there are hierarchical entitlements. Even like when somebody can come and say, well, the Rav says we have to have sex. That's hierarchical on two levels. That's the husband and then the Rav.
That's right.
This is not okay. Ethically, this is not okay.
And I agree.
Okay, I'm glad you agree. The question is, will everyone else agree?
Right. I mean, I guess what I'll say, and once again, I don't want to try and fall into apologetics and say, no, the Torah was anticipating the exact same things that we are thinking nowadays in the year 2022. I'm not saying that. At the same time, you're right. There are sources we could look at which are not in the same spirit as what I mentioned now. There are other sources, as you referred to in episode 9, that are more along the lines of forcing a woman, such as the example of if she makes a neder, a promise, a vow, not to have sex with her husband, the Gemara says that she can be forced to have sex with her husband. And by the way, the Rashba points out that it goes in both directions. If the husband makes a neder not to have sex with his wife, he can be forced to have sex with his wife. But my point isn't about specific sources that do imply that coercive sex in certain circumstances is allowed. My point is not that there are some sources that say that coercive sex is prohibited, though that's true. My point also is not that the weight of opinion in Shas is that coercive sex is prohibited. That's also true. But what I am saying is this. I'm saying that the way that the halacha developed over time, and I don't mean in the 21st century, I mean in the Torah, and I mean in the Shulchan Aruch, and I mean the Magen Avraham, the time of the Rishonim, the Achronim, many, many years ago, not in the 21st century at all, hundreds of years ago, it also was established that coercive sex is not allowed. When I said that enthusiastic consent is an ideal, and yet coercive consent and perhaps unwilling consent is not halachically acceptable, this is not something that was said by Rav Moshe Feinstein last century. This is something that was said by the Magen Avraham. So yes, we have to be careful. We have to make sure that we don't fall into saying every single source validates what we say today. But it's more than just some sources do. It's the way halacha developed over time, emphasize those same sources that we would want it to emphasize, frankly, now.
Yeah, and I think that we have said this before, that there is a halachic approach which is based on laws, and those laws are there for a reason, but that the big picture is that it doesn't mean that this is how we are going to guide our approach. In other words, we want to have a more ideological approach to marriage and to consent and to mutuality. We don't want to have to stoop to that level of using the fact that there does exist a hierarchy, and there does exist. If you look hard enough, you're going to find it. But if you have to use it, then that's already a really big problem. If you're going to be using those sources to oppress, to coerce, to get what you want, that's not going to end up being a happy marriage. It's going to end up being a very difficult marriage.
I agree. I will say, in terms of using sources, it is interesting that 42 years ago, in 1980, the Israeli Supreme Court ruled that spousal rape is rape 100%. And Justice David Bechor, in his decision, cited Jewish sources. He cited the Gemara in Eruvin, he cited the Rambam. This was not a kiruv rabbi trying to show that Jewish sources anticipated something that modern morality would espouse. It was the opposite. It was saying, how do we know that spousal rape should be illegal? We don't have to look to modern mores. We don't have to look to common law. We can look at our own Jewish sources, and it's right there. And I don't know what people thought in 1980. It was 42 years ago. It could have been quite different from the way people think now. But yeah, he certainly was saying that the Jewish sources were, so to speak, ahead of their time when it comes to this particular issue.
Yeah. No, good. That's true. Now, I want to add one other thing to this conversation. Also might sound a little controversial, but I'm not going to shy away from controversy since we're talking about Jewish sexual ethics. When we look for the universal sources of consent out there in the Western world, and, I have an article by Emily Nagoski. I send it to you. It's in our show notes. Okay, this isn't coming from Torah L'Moshe Missinai. It's coming from secular sources. Those sources are looking at consent in sexual relationships. Sexual relationships don't just take place in marriage in these societies, they take place between teenagers. They're talking about sexual consent even on hookups. However, I will say that these discussions of consent are not irrelevant. In fact, are very relevant to teenagers and to singles and to divorced people and to people who are not in a framework of marriage. People who have questions about boundaries and consent that are going to be outside the realm of strict halachic permissibility. And so when we talk about touch, we can't just talk about being shomer or not being shomer. We also have to be able to value and acknowledge that people are going to choose to engage sexually outside of the halachic framework. And these rules of consent, according to the Jewish ethics of non-coercion, should apply. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? Do you agree with that, Scott?
I agree with it. I think it's very difficult. I've heard a lot of talk about this recently. It's very difficult to balance teaching people about something which you say is fundamentally prohibited according to Jewish law in the Jewish context. To say that in Jewish law, you are not allowed to have premarital sex. If you do have premarital sex, Jewish law says the following. And it's sort of this almost oxymoronic type of conversation. But frankly, my inclination is to agree with you that there is so much more potential damage done if we don't have these conversations. We can't pretend that just because we had a conversation about consent in a non-marital context, that therefore sex is permitted in that context according to Jewish law. We're not going to say that. But at the same time, we have to have that conversation, because if we don't have that conversation, oy vavoy lanu, terrible things can happen.
I think it's within the spirit of Judaism. I mean, when you think about it, Jewish law probably does not want you to ideally capture a beautiful woman in war. They say to you, well, if you're going to do that, then at least, wait 30 days, shave her head or whatever it is that you do to kind of teach you that it's a Jewish ethic to not be so impulsive and to just wait a little bit. Or Jewish law may not really want you to take the baby chicks. And so it says, but if you're going to do that, then at least send away the mother. It's not a mitzvah to go find a nest.
Well, the Kabbalists would say that it is, but we won't get into that now.
Oh, okay.
That's a whole separate story.
Right. But I mean, it's really like there's some kind of these b'diavad situations where if you're going to
but the big difference there, Talli, is that you're right. And I agree with you. The problem is this, which is that in the case of the Eshet Yifat Torah that you first referenced, that you should not go and take a captive wife. But if you do, this is how you do it. But if you do, this is how you do it, is still within the framework of halacha.
Right,
I mean,
exactly.
The Torah is saying, do it this way.
I recognize that. I recognize that it's not codified and, we're making it up as we go along,
it sort of reminds me a little bit.
Discussion.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit in a very, very different way. I'll say lahavdil. I once read a person saying some advice his father gave him: never hit, and if you do hit hard and fast. And on some level, he's talking about dealing with bullies. What is that supposed to mean? It means that I'm telling you the basic value, the framework in which we're working. If you're not going to work within that framework, which I'm telling you you should, but if you're not going to work within that framework, that doesn't mean I have nothing to say to you anymore. It doesn't mean that there's no more conversation to be had. There is still a conversation that we can continue, because people aren't perfect. You're not going to listen to everything I say. And by extension, you're not going to listen to everything that Jewish law says. I think you should. And if you don't, keep this in mind. I think it's dangerous, but it's necessary. It is the kind of situation where people will read into it and say, oh, it's allowed, I guess, or he's implying that it's not so bad. And we have to be careful that we don't falsify Jewish law by pretending that things that are prohibited are actually not prohibited. That said, I think the consequences of not having those conversations are much worse.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, Talli, to sum up, can you just give a few sentences or a few paragraphs about the complexity of desire? We've spoken a lot about consent and how it relates to different levels of desire and how desire relates to consent. But obviously, desire itself is a very complicated subject too. So could you talk a little bit about the different levels of desire?
Yeah, so it's not really about levels. It's really about what desire means. There really is no agreement on how to measure desire and what desire really is. When you think about the word desire, some people might think lust, passion, romance. They might think sensuality. They might think desire as something that you can't have. A lot of literature about desire, female desire particularly, is that a lot of the desire is for what you cannot have, that you don't even need to consummate the actual act. It's more about the thinking about getting there than the act itself. So there's so many different ways to think about desire. And also people tend to kind of lump desire and arousal together. Does desire mean being sexually aroused or genitally aroused? Is there a difference between desire to have sex, which is based on motivation, pleasure seeking, as opposed to just feeling turned on, so to speak, aroused? Is it the same thing? Does desire mean interest? Does desire mean incentive? Does desire mean just kind of wanting? And there's really no one way to frame it. There's no one way to describe it, but it is affected and influenced by so many factors. It can be hormonal. It can have to do with how tired you are. It can have to do with the relationship. It can have to do with your ability to desire anything in life. There are some people that have a very funny relationship with pleasure. They don't desire anything. They don't allow themselves to. So there are so many different factors that go into the idea of desire, the idea of passion, the idea of drive, the idea of pleasure-seeking behavior, the idea of having a sexual sense of self, having entitlement, having permission to want to be sexual, and a lot of things that can bring that down, the brakes. What puts the brakes on desire is shame, guilt, messages that it's a bad thing to want sex, anger at your partner. There's so many different things that can put the brakes on desire that it's really very much about like a car. The car moves if you have a good balance between the brakes and the gas.
The one thing which I'll add, we mentioned this on an earlier podcast, is that as you mentioned, arousal and desire perhaps being in some cases synonymous, it's important to note, I assume you're going to agree with me. If you disagree, let me know, but that arousal is not a sign of desire. There can be arousal without desire, and that's why arousal is not a sign that there was no coercion. There can certainly be arousal alongside full coercion. I think it's important to mention that too.
Yeah. Did we talk about that?
I think we once mentioned that in the past.
Yeah. That is very important, that there is a reflexive physiological response that is an autonomic nervous system response that can happen whether you desire or don't desire. It's a protective response in many cases. It can be lubrication can occur even if a woman is raped. This is important research that was done years ago. And yeah, very often sexual arousal can occur completely in the absence of desire.
I think this was a very important episode, Talli, and I'm glad that we had the opportunity to record it today, and I hope that our listeners feel the same.
I also urge our listeners to send in your feedback. We had been asked to do an episode like this for a while. Keep sending in your ideas. We will go back to the life cycle. We started out with infertility and then pregnancy. We still want to be able to talk about midlife and menopause and old age and illness and also second marriages. There's a lot that we still have to talk about.
There is no end to the topics we can discuss. Remember to check out the website, intimatejudaism.com. As I mentioned, there will be show notes there on the link to this particular podcast. Subscribe to Intimate Judaism on your favorite podcast provider. Join us on Patreon. Write to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Visit jewishcoffeehouse.com and tallirosenbaum.com. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Bye.